Welcome back to the Compost Pile, your source for all things gardening and homesteading. Today, I'm out here in the garden by myself today, and I wanted to take an opportunity to talk about a very simple topic, and that's the fact that the plants are kind of talking to us. They're telling us something, and are we looking and listening to the signs that they're putting out there? It's very rare that a plant just dies or just randomly fails. Most of the time, all these plants are telling us something, and they're giving us indicators of where to look to find the resolution to the problem. And is it always easy to figure it out? No. And sometimes we can't. But most of the time, especially for those of you who've been gardening for a while, the more you observe your surroundings and what's happening out here, the easier it is to begin to identify common traits and things that happen and where to go to find the resolution. So it's a little bit rainy out here today, unexpected evening rain, but we're going to walk around and we're going to take a look at several different things and see what we can find and talk about observing what the plants are telling us. One of the most common ways that plants tell us that there might be something wrong is through the actual foliage. This pineapple sage here has been doing really well. It's full of blooms. It's a great pollinator attractor, really great for hummingbirds. And over the past week, we're starting to see yellowing or light colored foliage. And this tends to happen as the plant begins to flower a lot and a lot of the nutrients begin to wash out. We've been getting a lot of rain, so nutrients are washing deeper into the soil, and then it's not necessarily being replenished, and this plant's pulling lots of nutrients out. So we might be seeing signs in the beginning of something like chlorosis, nitrogen deficiency, just general nutrient deficiencies. And this is an easy way for us to tell. Doesn't mean we need to jump to doing something right now. We're going to continue to kind of monitor this and see what actually happens. And if probably later in the week we're still seeing the same trend going, then we know we might need to do some type of supplemental fertilization to get this plant to green back up, to put the minerals and nutrients back into the soil so that this plant can continue to bloom and thrive and support the pollinators that would put it here for. It's also not uncommon when you start seeing yellow leaves, like on a plant like this. It's not a very large plant, and there are maybe some deficiencies happening here beginning to take place, but sometimes your older limbs and foliage are going to begin to yellow as the nutrients are being pushed up to the fruiting limbs and the flowers and maybe the young tender growth. So sometimes this is just kind of a natural attrition, and we don't really need to do anything about this particular branch. We might just simply prune it off so that it diverts the energy upward. And as I mentioned about nutrient availability, especially that's something you want to pay attention to in containers, because you can see here, this plant is really got a nice deep green look to it. And then we pan over here to this one, and it's a much lighter foliage. And this can be an indication that maybe our container grown pots are just not getting enough supplementation. The nutrients wash out faster in the pots. So this particular setup, we should have done a lot more to feed this particular type of soil to hold nutrients more consistently. Not only do we need to pay attention to the actual foliage because they can tell us things, we need to pay attention to the fruit as well. Especially in container grown again, you can see here we've got blossom end rot. This was something we already knew about and we've done some treatments for, because container grown plant, the nutrients again are going to wash out quicker. This leads in this particular situation to a calcium deficiency in the root zone, not supplying enough to the plant, so we get the blossom end of the tomato rotting. So again, the plants are going to tell us a lot about what is actually happening in the soil, in the actual plant, And with a little bit of homework, we can assess the problem and figure out what's happening. Something else that leaves can tell us is maybe a lack of water or moisture. These guys recently, I planted them and they just plopped right over. They got really, really dry. I was able to water them and they perked back up. So foliage is one way that can help us identify moisture issues by identifying wilting. Now, wilting doesn't always mean that it's a lack of water. We can actually see wilting happen from heat stress. So maybe there's plenty of moisture down in the root zone, but maybe the plant is just drooping as a protective measure. We see this a lot in maybe sweet peppers, banana peppers. Some of these peppers will begin to droop the leaves, and sometimes that's just a reaction to the environment around it. Doesn't necessarily mean that there's a problem. Now, if this plant began to droop more and more and it didn't recover overnight, we might have a root rot problem. So it could lead to excessive moisture inside of the root zone. It could just be heat stress. It could be a lot of factors, but it tells us that there's some kind of stressful issue happening, whether it be water, heat, or environmental. So I'm standing next to this Rapunzel tomato just to give you an idea of its size. And one of the things that the structure of this plant can tell me is that honestly I didn't do a really good job of supporting it. This is an indeterminate tomato. I've grown it before. I knew this was going to happen, and I just really wasn't prepared to handle this kind of growth and this kind of fruit set. This thing is loaded down. So the way your plant is growing can give you some indicators on how you might address common issues such as trellising, stringing these things up maybe to get them to grow taller, more upright. They can also tell you a little bit about pruning. I should have probably taken more time to open this thing up. So this thing is really difficult to assess, maybe whether I have ripe fruit, whether I'm having pest issues, because it's hard to see in here. So this kind of growth, it's all over the place, it's tangled. This is an easy indicator that I could do some really heavy pruning on this, eradicate some of these non-fruiting limbs, and simply open it up, which would drastically help us in the event that we begin to get disease pressure, where if it starts getting humid, we can try to prevent some of the common diseases that can spread rapidly by moisture. It's a good example right here. Makes it really difficult to assess pest problems when you let your plant grow like this. There's nothing wrong with this, but definitely could have done a better job. So take a look at what you see if you're watching the video version of this, or if you're not, tune in. And you can see when you have dense foliage and there's not a lot of airflow in here, then you can make it very difficult to determine whether you have ripe fruit. So the camera's pointed at an entire cluster of ripe Rapunzel tomatoes, but you can barely see them. We just noticed them today. And so it makes it more difficult to get your production if you can't see what you're working with. That one's not right, but these guys are ready to go. Now we're actually going to pull off the ones that are blushing early. Well, I would like to let them ripen on the vine. This season has been very difficult with worms and caterpillars. There's another one right there. So we're going to remove that And we're going to get these guys early so that we don't lose them to the pest. So leaves can also tell us something about pest pressure. If you look, you can see this section of the plant is riddled with holes in the leaves, and by a quick glance you don't really see anything. But most likely we have a worm or a caterpillar, or in this instance many of them. They're hiding out on the underside of the leaves. Worms and caterpillars don't really like to be out in the open. They stay out in the sun or somewhere where it's really warm. They're going to struggle because they're going to lose their moisture content in their body. So they tend to hide on the underside of leaves. And you can see they've done a pretty good job of eating up this plant and many other ones that we have in the garden. And we've been constantly clipping, searching, picking and removing to the best of our ability in hopes that we're going to save most of the produce we have. We have lost some, but that's just part of it. And if we were not near the ripening stage, most likely we would spray with something like BT to try to preserve the harvest. Another way your plant can tell you something about environmental conditions are if maybe you're dropping your blossoms or your buds, you're not actually setting the tiny fruit. Maybe they're just falling off and you're never getting that. That's a really common problem on tomatoes, and it's something that happens to the vast majority of people who plant late in the season. They think, yeah, it's a warm season crop, it's going to be fine, but what they don't realize is that not all plants require pollinators. This tomato plant contains both the male and female parts in the flower, and once it gets really hot in southeast Texas, the humidity gets high, so the pollen gets tacky, and then in turn it doesn't pollinate, and that can lead to blooms falling off and then not getting any fruit set. So you have a beautiful plant but no fruit. So it's one way, again, that your plant can tell you something that's happening environmentally or in the soil or internally. You can also look up if you see yellowing in your leaves and it's starting to happen over a big section of the plant and it's moving through. It's an easy way you can look up and find the different mineral deficiencies. It's going to tell you or give you a really good indicator of what's missing so that you can go back in and supply that. Now I find if I'm feeding a pretty balanced organic diet to the soil, that most of the time I don't really deal with a lot of mineral deficiencies. It's not to say that we couldn't get them or they have never happened, but overall we don't experience a lot of those, but the leaves will tell you what is lacking. The idea that Epsom salt can make your plant produce more or thrive more is a great example. It's only helpful if you have a magnesium deficiency, which you can tell from looking at the actual foliage. So it's a good concept there that the plant will tell you what's missing. Another common observation that we find that often jumps people to applying products into the garden, typically fungal related products like fungicides, and that's mushrooms. So we're getting lots of moisture, some good rains coming out. So fungal activity or actual mushrooms or fungal growth is not uncommon. And unlike what most people think, this is actually a great sign. These mushrooms are the fruiting body of the fungal microbes that are populated in the soil that are helping our plants and soil stay healthy and be able to get the nutrients that we need. They show us that our soil is living and that nutrients and organic matter, like where once this magnolia tree was, that those microbes are in there doing their job and they're feeding the soil, helping us break down nutrients and provide them to plants if we had them in this area. So things like this happen all the time in our actual garden beds, and it comes in all shapes and sizes. So by observation, we can see some of the things that we're doing in the garden are paying off because we have fruiting bodies of fungal growth. right here in the middle of everything. One of the most common observations that people have when they're out and about in their garden is the fact that they do or don't have pollinators. And when you look at that, most of the time there's not a diverse amount of flower shapes and sizes. So you can take a look at my small bed here. I've got, maybe 5 or 10 different colors, different shapes and sizes, different species. But even this is still not done to the best of its ability. I have some different things to attract different types of pollinators, from hummingbirds to bumblebees, butterflies, just the imported honeybees. But I don't have enough of any one given thing to really make something that will thrive. So I can have pollinators come and they're going to get the resources that are available. And then when those resources are gone, they're going to go away. And then we're going to have to wait until the next bloom cycle to have those pollinators potentially come back. And it may be a totally different set. So if we're wanting to create pollinators inside of our space, whether it be for growing food, fruit, or just ornamentals, we need to plant in blocks. So if I had to do this over again, I would probably have planted these salvias a little tighter, and I probably would have planted bigger groupings of individual types of plants to give a nice stand and a nice quantity of pollen and nectar from those. And then I would have spaced it out more across the garden. This was just an experiment. Usually we have plenty of pollinators, but so far this season, I feel it's been a little lackluster. And I don't think that's because we're doing anything wrong here. I think a lot of it is environmental, but it's one of the observations that I had that I feel I could do better, and that maybe you could too, to make a thriving ecosystem in your garden. Lastly, as we're strolling through, one thing that can tell us a lot more than we think are weeds like this guy. We don't typically deal with a lot of weeds inside of our particular garden, but it is a really common problem, but they can tell us a lot. So this tiny little weed that we pulled up, we can learn a lot by looking specifically at the root system. So we have one main single root, and we have basically a taproot. So one of the things that taproots tell us is that maybe we're dealing with some compaction. And if I look really specifically where this particular weed was growing, it's growing in this long shade bed. But why would that matter? Well, it was growing almost dead center of the bed, which happens to fall at the roof line. And oftentimes in some of our really heavy rains, our gutter overflows and it runs right down the center. And that causes compaction of the soil. The weight of the water presses down. So this weed is serving a purpose by opening up the soil with that taproot, trying to break open that compaction. So it's a good sign that maybe we should do some aerating techniques. Maybe we should loosen up this soil very casually and gently to help open up oxygen, help the moisture get deeper into it, and make the plant roots be able to thrive. On the other end of the spectrum, maybe the soil would be really, really loose. Maybe we could pull it up and it has fibrous roots and it's got a lot of soil attached to it. That would show us that our soil is too loose and maybe we're dealing with erosion. So those roots are holding onto that soil, helping keep it in place, preventing erosion, keeping the land in place and nutrients in place. So interesting enough, weeds can tell us a lot. While not every weed can tell us this, some weeds will grow in areas where there are nutrient deficiencies. Dandelions are known to grow in areas where there is a deficiency in calcium. So it's interesting, if you take some time and really identify certain things that are growing naturally in spaces, you can learn a lot about the soil and its conditions, maybe the environment around, by why and what this thing requires to grow and thrive. So summer's right around the corner, and I hope maybe I've given you some insight and some encouragement to stop and take a look at your space, walk around, just look, dig in, see what's behind all these foliage, and maybe you'll find something that you didn't know was there. Maybe you'll find a problem you didn't know. Maybe you'll learn something about your specific space. So really this episode was to encourage you to just observe, to go out and look at what you've created, whether you're happy with it or not, and learn from it, because plants can tell us so much about what's actually happening. So I know my plants are talking to me. Are yours? And are you actually listening? We'll catch you next time on the Compost Pile. Thanks for listening.